The sun was about to reach the top of the heavy tall bushes on the west side of the house. There were about 2 hours of daylight left. "Why don't you call Genaro?" Don Juan said casually. My body jumped. My initial reaction was to drop everything and run for my car. Don Juan broke into a belly laugh. I told him that I did not have to prove anything to myself and that I was perfectly content to talk to him. Don Juan couldn't stop laughing. Finally, he said that it was a shame that Don Genaro wasn't there to enjoy a great scene. "Look, if you're not interested in calling Genaro, I am," he said in a resolute tone. "I like his company." I had a terrible sour taste on the roof of my mouth. Beads of perspiration ran down from my brow and my upper lip. I wanted to say something, but there was really nothing to say. Don Juan gave me a long, scrutinizing look. "Come on," he said. "A warrior is always ready. To be a warrior is not a simple matter of wishing to be one. It is rather an endless struggle that will go on to the very last moment of our lives. Nobody is born a warrior, in exactly the same way that nobody is born a reasonable being. We make ourselves into one or the other. Pull yourself together. I don't want Genaro to see you shivering like this." He stood up and paced back and forth on the clean floor of the ramada. I couldn't remain impassive. My nervousness was so intense that I couldn't write anymore, and I jumped to my feet. Don Juan made me jog on the spot, facing the west. He had made me perform the same movements before on various occasions. The idea was to draw power from the impending twilight by raising one's arms to the sky with the fingers stretched like a fan, and then clasp them forcefully when the arms were in the midpoint between the horizon and the zenith. The exercise worked, and I became almost instantly calm and collected. I couldn't avoid wondering, however, what had happened to the old me that could never have relaxed so completely by performing those simple and idiotic movements. I wanted to focus all my attention on the procedure that Don Juan was doubtlessly going to follow to call Don Genaro. I anticipated some portentous acts. Don Juan stood on the edge of the ramada, facing the southeast, cupped his hands around his mouth, and yelled, "Genaro, come here!" A moment later, Don Genaro emerged from the chaparral. Both of them were beaming. They practically danced in front of me. Don Genaro greeted me effusively and then sat down on the milk crate. There was something dreadfully wrong with me. I was calm, unruffled. Some incredible state of indifference and aloofness had taken over my entire being. It was almost as if I were watching myself from a hiding place. In a very nonchalant manner, I proceeded to tell Don Genaro that during my last visit, he had nearly scared me to death, and that not even during my experiences with psychotropic plants had I been in such a complete state of chaos. Both of them celebrated my statements as if they were meant to be funny. I laughed with them. They obviously were aware of my state of emotional numbness. They watched me and humored me as if I were drunk. There was something inside me that fought desperately to turn the situation into something familiar. I wanted to be concerned and afraid. Don Juan finally splashed some water on my face and urged me to sit down and take notes. He said, as he had done before, that either I took notes or I died. The mere act of putting down some words brought back my familiar mood. It was as if something became crystal clear again, something that a moment before had been opaque and numb. The advent of my usual self also meant the advent of my usual fears. Strangely enough, I was less afraid of being afraid than of being unafraid. The familiarity of my old habits, no matter how unpleasant they were, was a delightful respite. I fully realized then that Don Genaro had just emerged from the chaparral. My usual processes were beginning to function. I started by refusing to think or speculate about the event. I made the resolution of not asking him anything. I was going to be a silent witness this time. "Genaro has come again, exclusively for you," Don Juan said. Don Genaro was leaning against the wall of the house, resting his back against it while he sat on a tilted milk crate. He looked as if he were riding on horseback. His hands were in front of him, giving the impression that he was holding the reins of a horse. "That's right, Carlitos," he said, and brought the milk crate to rest on the ground. He dismounted, whirling his right leg over an imaginary neck of a horse, and then jumped to the ground. His movements were so perfectly executed that he gave me the unquestionable sensation that he had arrived on horseback. He came to my side and sat down to my left. "Genaro has come because he wants to tell you about the other," Don Juan said. He made a gesture of giving Don Genaro the floor. Don Genaro bowed. He turned slightly to face me. "What would you like to know, Carlitos?" he asked in a high-pitched voice. "Well, if you're going to tell me about the double, tell me everything," I said, feigning casualness. Both of them shook their heads and glanced at each other. "Genaro is going to tell you about the dreamer and the dreamed," Don Juan said. "As you know, Carlitos," Don Genaro said with the air of an orator warming up, "the double begins in dreaming." He gave me a long look and smiled. His eyes swept from my face to my notebook and pencil. "The double is a dream," he said, scratched his arms, and then stood up. He walked to the edge of the ramada and stepped out into the chaparral. He stood by a bush, showing 3/4 of his profile to us. He was apparently urinating. After a moment, I noticed that there seemed to be something wrong with him. He appeared to be trying desperately to urinate, but could not. Don Juan's laughter was the clue that Don Genaro was clowning again. Don Genaro contorted his body in such a comical fashion that he had Don Juan and me practically in hysterics. Don Genaro came back to the ramada and sat down. His smile radiated a rare warmth. "When you can't, you just can't," he said, and shrugged his shoulders. Then, after a moment's pause, he added, sighing, "Yes, Carlitos, the double is a dream." "Do you mean that he's not real?" I asked. "No, I mean that he is a dream," he retorted. Don Juan intervened and explained that Don Genaro was referring to the first emergence of the awareness that we are luminous beings. "Each one of us is different, and thus the details of our struggles are different," Don Juan said. "The steps that we follow to arrive at the double are the same, though, especially the beginning steps, which are muddled and uncertain." Don Genaro agreed and made a comment on the uncertainty that a sorcerer had at that stage. "When it first happened to me, I didn't know it had happened," he explained. "One day, I had been picking plants in the mountains. I had gone into a place that was worked by other herb collectors. I had 2 huge sacks of plants. I was ready to go home, but before I did, I decided to take a moment's rest. I lay down on the side of the trail in the shade of a tree, and I fell asleep. I heard then the sound of people coming down the hill and woke up. I hurriedly ran for cover and hid behind some bushes a short distance across the road from where I'd fallen asleep. While I hid there, I had the nagging impression I had forgotten something. I looked to see if I had my 2 sacks of plants. I didn't have them. I looked across the road to the place where I'd been sleeping, and I nearly dropped my pants with fright. I was still there, asleep. It was me. I touched my body. I was myself. By that time, the people that were coming down from the hill were upon the me that was asleep, while the me that was fully awake looked helplessly from my hiding place. Damn it to hell, they were going to find me there and take my sacks away. But they went by me, as if I weren't there at all. My vision had been so vivid that I went wild. I screamed, and then I woke up again. Damn it, it had been a dream. Don Genaro stopped his account and looked at me as if waiting for a question or a comment. Tell him where you woke up the second time, Don Juan said. I woke up by the road, Don Genaro said, where I had fallen asleep, but for one moment I didn't quite know where I really was. I can almost say that. I was still looking at myself waking up, then something pulled me to the side of the road and I found myself rubbing my eyes. There was a long pause. I didn't know what to say. And what did you do next? Don Juan asked. I realized when both of them began to laugh that he was teasing me. He was imitating my questions. Don Genaro went on talking. He said that he was stunned for a moment and then went to check everything. The place where I had hid was there exactly as I had seen it, he said, and the people who had walked by me were down the road a short distance away. I know it because I ran downhill after them. They were the same people I had seen. I followed them until they got to town. They must have thought I was mad. I asked them if they had seen my friend sleeping by the side of the road. They all said they hadn't. You see, Don Juan said, all of us go through the same doubts. We are afraid of being mad. Unfortunately for us, of course. All of us are already mad. You are a tinge madder than us, though, Don Genaro said to me and winked. And more suspicious. They teased me about my suspiciousness, and then Don Genaro began to talk again. All of us are dense beings, he said. You're not the only one, Carlitos. I was a bit shook up by my dream for a couple of days, but then I had to work for my living and take care of too many things and really had no time for pondering upon the mystery of my dreams. So I forgot about it in no time at all. I was very much like you. But one day, a few months later, after a terribly tiring day, I fell asleep like a log in mid-afternoon. It had just started to rain, and a leak in the roof woke me up. I jumped out of bed and climbed on top of the house to fix the leak before it began to pour. I felt so fine and strong that I finished in 1 minute, and I didn't even get wet. I thought that the snooze I had taken had done me a lot of good. When I was through, I went back into the house to get something to eat, and I realized that I couldn't swallow. I thought I was sick. I mashed some roots and leaves and wrapped them around my neck and went to my bed, and then again when I got to my bed, I nearly dropped my pants. I was there in bed, asleep. I wanted to shake myself and wake me up, but I knew that that was not the thing one should do, so I ran out of the house. I was panic-stricken. I roamed around the hills aimlessly. I had no idea where I was going, and although I had lived all my life there, I got lost. I walked in the rain and didn't even feel it. It seemed that I couldn't think. Then the lightning and thunder became so intense that I woke up again. He paused for a moment. Do you want to know where I woke up? He asked me. Certainly, Don Juan answered. I woke up in the hills in the rain, he said. But how did you know that you had woken up? I asked. My body knew it, he replied. That was a stupid question, Don Juan interjected. You yourself know that something in the warrior is always aware of every change. It is precisely the aim of the warrior's way to foster and maintain that awareness. The warrior cleans it, shines it, and keeps it running. He was right. I had to admit to them that I knew there was something in me that registered and was aware of everything I did, and yet it had nothing to do with the ordinary awareness of myself. It was something else which I could not pin down. I told them that perhaps Don Genaro could describe it better than I. "You're doing very well yourself," Don Genaro said. "It's an inner voice that tells you what's what." And at that time it told me that I had woken up a second time. Of course, as soon as I woke up, I became convinced that I must have been dreaming. Obviously, it hadn't been an ordinary dream, but it hadn't been dreaming proper either, so I settled for something else. Walking in my sleep, half awake, I suppose. I could not understand it in any other way. Don Genaro said that his benefactor had explained to him that what he had gone through was not a dream at all, and that he shouldn't insist on regarding it as walking in his sleep. "What did he tell you that it was?" I asked. They exchanged a glance. "He told me it was the boogeyman," Don Genaro replied, affecting the tone of a small child. I explained to them that I wanted to know if Don Genaro's benefactor explained things in the same way they themselves did. "Of course he did," Don Juan said. "My benefactor explained that the dream in which one was watching oneself asleep," Don Genaro went on, "was the time of the double. He recommended that rather than wasting my power in wondering and asking myself questions, I should use the opportunity to act, and that when I had another chance, I should be prepared. My next chance took place at my benefactor's house. I was helping him with the housework. I had lain down to rest, and as usual, I fell sound asleep. His house was definitely a place of power for me, and helped me. I was suddenly aroused by a loud noise and awakened. My benefactor's house was large. He was a wealthy man and had many people working for him. The noise seemed to be the sound of a shovel digging in gravel. I sat up to listen, and then I stood up. The noise was very unsettling to me, but I couldn't figure out why. I was pondering whether to go and check it out when I noticed that I was asleep on the floor. This time, I knew what to expect and what to do, and I followed the noise. I walked to the back of the house. There was no one there. The noise seemed to come from beyond the house. I kept on following it. The more I followed it, the quicker I could move. I ended up at a distant place, witnessing incredible things. He explained that at the time of those events, he still was in the beginning stages of his apprenticeship and had done very little in the realm of dreaming, but that he had an uncanny facility to dream that he was looking at himself. "Where did you go, Don Genaro?" I asked. "That was the first time that I had really moved in dreaming," he said. "I knew enough about it to behave correctly, though. I didn't look at anything directly and ended up in a deep ravine where my benefactor had some of his power plants." "Do you think it works better if one knows very little about dreaming?" I asked. "No," Don Juan interjected. "Each of us has a facility for something in particular. Genaro's knack is for dreaming." "What did you see in the ravine, Don Genaro?" I asked. "I saw my benefactor doing some dangerous maneuvers with people. I thought I was there to help him and hid behind some trees, yet I couldn't have known how to help. I wasn't dumb, though, and I realized that the scene was there for me to watch, not to act in." "When and how and where did you wake up?" "I don't know when I woke up. It must have been hours later. All I know is that I followed my benefactor and the other men, and when they were about to reach my benefactor's house, the noise that they made, because they were arguing, woke me up. I was at the place where I had seen myself asleep. Upon waking up, I realized that whatever I had seen and done was not a dream. I had actually gone some distance away, guided by the sound. Was your benefactor aware of what you were doing? Certainly. He had been making the noise with the shovel to help me accomplish my task. When he walked into the house, he pretended to scold me for falling asleep. I knew that he had seen me. Later on, after his friends had left, he told me that he had noticed my glow hiding behind the trees. Don Genaro said that those 3 instances set him off on the path of dreaming, and that it took him 15 years to have his next chance. The 4th time was a more bizarre and a more complete vision, he said. I found myself asleep in the middle of a cultivated field. I saw myself lying there on my side, sound asleep. I knew that it was dreaming because I had set myself to do dreaming every night. Usually, every time I had seen myself asleep, I was at the site where I had gone to sleep. This time, I was not in my bed, and I knew I had gone to bed that night. In this dreaming, it was daytime, so I began to explore. I moved away from the place where I was lying and oriented myself. I knew where I was. I was actually not too far from my house, perhaps a couple of miles away. I walked around, looking at every detail of the place. I stood in the shade of a big tree a short distance away and peered across a flat strip of land to some cornfields on the side of a hill. Something quite unusual struck me then. The details of the surroundings didn't change or vanish no matter how long I peered at them. I got scared and ran back to where I was sleeping. I was still there, exactly as I had been before. I began to watch myself. I had an eerie feeling of indifference towards the body I was watching. Then I heard the sound of people approaching. People always seemed to be around for me. I ran up ahead to a small hill and carefully watched from there. There were 10 people coming to the field where I was. They were all young men. I ran back to where I was lying and went through one of the most agonizing times of my life while I faced myself lying there snoring like a pig. I knew that I had to awaken me, but I had no idea how. I also knew that it was deadly for me to awaken myself. But if those young men were to find me there, they were going to be very upset. All those deliberations that were going through my mind were not really thoughts. They were more appropriately scenes in front of my eyes. My worrying, for instance, was a scene in which I looked at myself while I had the sensation of being boxed in. I call that worrying. It has happened to me a number of times after that first time. Well, since I didn't know what to do, I stood looking at myself, waiting for the worst. A bunch of fleeting images went past me in front of my eyes. I hung onto one in particular, the sight of my house and my bed. The image became very clear. Oh, how I wished to be back in my bed. Something shook me then. It felt like someone was hitting me, and I woke up. I was on my bed. Obviously, I had been dreaming. I jumped out of bed and ran to the place of my dreaming. It was exactly as I had seen it. The young men were working there. I watched them for a long time. They were the same ones I had seen. I came back to the same place at the end of the day after everybody had gone and stood at the very spot where I had seen myself asleep. Someone had lain there. The weeds were crumpled. Don Juan and Don Genaro were observing me. They looked like 2 strange animals. I felt a shiver in my back. I was on the verge of indulging in the very rational fear that they were not really men like myself, but Don Genaro laughed. In those days, he said, I was just like you, Carlitos. I wanted to check everything. I was as suspicious as you are. He paused, raised his finger, and shook it at me. Then he faced Don Juan. Weren't you as suspicious as this guy? He asked. Not a chance, Don Juan said. He's the champ. Don Genaro turned to me and made a gesture of apology. I think I was wrong, he said. I was not as suspicious as you. They chuckled softly as if they didn't want to make noise. Don Juan's body convulsed with muffled laughter. This is a place of power for you, Don Genaro said in a whisper. You've written your fingers off, right where you're sitting. Have you ever done some heavy dreaming here? No, he hasn't, Don Juan said in a low voice. But he's done some heavy writing. They doubled up. It seemed that they didn't want to laugh out loud. Their bodies shook. Their soft laughter was like a rhythmical cackle.